Now let's drill down even further and look at classical conditioning as Ivan Pavlov discovered it. Actually, Pavlov was a physiologist, and he was studying the saliva patterns of dogs at the time, and he was all about physiology. He suited the dog, he fitted the dog with a vial that would siphon away the salivation. But he found something interesting, is that the one thing that we know of and we refer to is we have food, provide food, and depending on the kind of dog, generally they will automatically start salivating, which we do as well, obviously. And this is an automatic process. This is referred to in his way of thinking, and I call it UCS because it's easier to understand. It's the unconditioned stimulus. Food always leads to salivating, and this is the unconditioned response. So at the risk of confusing you, your book uses uses the US, unconditioned stimulus, and the UR, and that's their term. Like I said, I prefer to capture all of it, and so I'm going to put in parentheses the way your book uses it. I'm going to follow my own protocol so that I can be consistent. So UCS always leads to UCR. Okay. The second thing he found, which this has already been known, everybody knows that, that's not new, but there was a neutral stimulus that he played with, that he also knew that the bell was a neutral stimulus, and that leads to no salivation. So the dog may kind of cock his head to the side at the sound, but there certainly is no salivation whatsoever in that regard with the bell. What he found, though, was that if there was a way for him to connect the bell plus the food, okay, so we have the NS, the neutral stimulus, connected to the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, and because the food, and I'm going to put all of this in a bracket for right now, because the food always connects up with salivation, which is the UCR, the unconditioned response. If we tie these two together, the bell and the food, on consistent trials, number of trials down here, all connected together, what happens is that the salivation happens, but the dog begins to understand that salivation, or that he gets hungry because there's something connected to the food. In other words, the bell, in a sense, predicts the food with repeated associations. So what begins to happen then is that the bell now becomes a conditioned response, CR, and it leads to salivation, which is you would say, well, that's still the unconditioned response. Well, actually, it's the, oops, I'm sorry. Let's back up here. Is the conditioned stimulus. It leads to the salivation, which is oftentimes the same as the unconditioned response, but now it is tied to a neutral stimulus. That's why we refer to it as a conditioned response. It started out as an unconditioned response because it was connected to an unconditioned stimulus. But over the repeated associations between the bell and the food, and the bell begins to act as a predictor to the dog, then the bell goes off, we have salivation before any food has ever been produced in the dog at all. And that's this is the primary underlying issue or process when we talk about classical conditioning. You always start out with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. UCS, UCR, USUR. We also have a neutral stimulus that leads to no response whatsoever, but when we pair the two together, the neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, before long the bell becomes the predictor and a conditioned stimulus that then leads to a conditioned response that is oftentimes the same as the unconditioned response. Okay? And so in a lot of cases, particularly when we get to even psych disorders, this process is the one that underlies phobia and anxiety. Because fear is a naturally occurring emotion, but it gets paired with something else. And because of that, then, like a feared object, for example, a snake, and we have extreme fear, extreme anxiety, and then you add in another situation where the snake bites or a dog bites, then it's just the sight of the dog that produces the extreme anxiety. And obviously we can live in our heads in such a way that these actual events don't have to happen. We just simply anticipate them, and we can have our bodies anticipate them, and our bodies will react as if they have already occurred. So that underlies some of the psych disorders we talk about when we talk about phobias, which are a subset actually of anxiety.